In this quick tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can transform your photos from a photo like this to a photo like this. Now there's some key elements to getting better photos like this, and the first thing to notice is on this first picture I've just left the camera on auto, and this is what's happened. It's chosen quite a low shutter speed, and we're getting blurring, and the light's not exactly how we want it. It doesn't capture any of the drama of the situation. The kind of composition is kind of boring, so I just wanted to run through how I got this second photo. Now our particular environment that we have, this is what we're dealing with. We just had a little simple little driveway situation, and you can see from here I didn't actually have any pond or anything in the foreground. So the real trick was I placed the camera right on the ground. I actually had a tripod plate underneath it, so I could just rest it directly on the driveway, and I placed the camera in the position here where there was a bit of a puddle in the foreground. And what that gave me is the ability to have a lot of reflection, because the camera is nice and low, it has all this water in the foreground, and you can get that beautiful reflection of the sunset. So that was the first step. The trick is to get that really unique angle on a relatively mundane scene. So you can see this is a lot more drama because we're having all that sunset reflected in the water there. So the first thing to actually take the shot, once I'd had the position correct, is to turn the camera over to manual. Now the reason I do that is because I actually want to control how much light I see. I actually want some of the foreground building and that to be silhouetted, because I really want those rich colors of the sunset to come out. What I do is I set it over to manual exposure, and my particular settings that I used in this photograph were f4. I could have actually used a much narrower aperture because it turns out I actually rested the camera on the ground. So in this case I could have taken it all the way up to something like f11 or f18 to get a much broader depth of field. But I was mostly concerned of having the distant things in focus, so I wasn't worried about that too much. And I actually was able to set the shutter speed at 1/60th. And once again I could have set a lower shutter speed because I actually had the camera rested on the ground here, so that wasn't too much of a problem. And the ISO was set at 320 in this case, so not much grain in the photograph because I'm using a relatively low ISO. You can push it all the way up to about 800 without getting too much grain, but I tend to try keep it low as possible. And in the case where you can use a tripod or rest the camera on a steady surface, then you can use lower ISOs, and it doesn't matter if the shutter speed is longer because you're not going to get blurring from movement. Once I'd taken that photograph, I took some test shots and then checked the histogram out and checked the LCD to make sure it was getting that rich sky color. So you take a few shots. If the sky's getting blown out, then you change your settings. You can either increase the shutter speed or close down that aperture till you get the right amount of light coming out of the sky. So this is what came directly out of the camera, and I brought it into Camera Raw for Photoshop just to show you some of the tweaks I did, because from what I remembered of the actual scene when I took photographs is the colors were a little richer, the sky was a little bluer, so I made some changes on the file here. The first step is the horizon line was a little bit off, so I basically moved in there and straighten that horizon line to the way I want it. So that was the first step. So now we have a straighter image here. Then the next thing is I found that the color temperature originally shot was a little bit too warm, so I actually turned that down a bit. So I'm turning down the color temperature, which results in making a cooler image here. So around 4700 is more like what I remember the scene to be. Now exposure, I turned that up a little bit just because I want a little bit brighter sky there. So the exposure was a little brighter in the scene, so I turned that up a little. And I turned up the recovery a bit so we don't blow out too many highlights. And then brightness is looking pretty good. I turned up the contrast a little because I do want the contrast to be a bit stronger in the scene, so that looks good. And then to just give the colors a bit more of a pop, I just turned the vibrance up, so quite high. You can see that really starts bringing out the reds and the blues there, and a teeny bit on the saturation to make those colors saturate a bit. You don't want to go too far on the saturation because otherwise things look really artificial. And that's pretty much it. So that's really improved that photograph a lot and made it really pop. So anyway, this is just a quick tutorial just to show you how you can get a relatively mundane scene, basically an ordinary scene, and create quite an extraordinary photograph in that scene. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you.